The chandeliers of the Spiegelsaal had been burning for 4 hours, and the candlelight had long since stopped flattering anyone. Theodolinde stood at the grand piano with the wife of the Austrian envoy, one hand resting on the lacquered lid, listening to a woman she had met twice describe the difficulties of Viennese winters. When she heard his footsteps behind her, not hurried, not particular, the footsteps of a man crossing a room because a room happened to be in his way. She had learned his footsteps in 8 months of marriage. She had learned a great deal in 8 months, she thought. And then Maximilian was at her elbow with a glass of wine he did not offer her. And he opened his mouth. And the words came out in the tone he used for protocol, matters requiring no reply. And 3 people within 4 meters heard every syllable. And the Spiegelsaal went on around them, as though the floor had not just shifted beneath her feet. She did not reach for the glass he was holding, as she set her own glass down on the piano, very carefully, without a sound, and she turned a half-step toward him, and she spoke. She had not planned those words. She had planned other things for 7 months, and those plans were already in motion. But the words she spoke in that moment were her own, arriving fully formed, quiet enough that they required the 3 witnesses to lean slightly forward to catch them. "Let us find out, Maximilian," Theodolinde said. "I will go to Burghausen tonight. In 6 weeks you will know whether you are right." Maximilian said nothing. The Austrian envoy's wife had gone very still beside the piano. Theodolinde picked up her glass, set it back down without drinking, and walked across the Spiegelsaal toward the east corridor. She did not look back. She did not need to. What Maximilian had said precisely was this: that his life would be better without her, that 3 months at court had confirmed it, and that he said it in the distracted tone of a man reading aloud from a document he had already decided to file. 5 words. Give or take the grammar. The 3 witnesses, Freiherr Ottmar Schönbrunn-Leitner and his wife, and a young attaché whose name Theodolinde had never learned, would remember the phrasing with the precision that people reserve for moments they did not expect to witness. Theodolinde walked to the east corridor, and then up the servants' stair to the 3rd floor, where Eleanor Hallwig was waiting in the dressing room with a candle, and the expression of a woman who has been a lady's maid for 25 years and has learned to read the sound of footsteps. "The large trunk," Theodolinde said, "and the document case. We leave before midnight." Eleanor did not ask what had happened. She had been with Theodolinde since she was 14 years old, and she understood that certain questions were answered more fully by the speed of packing than by any reply Theodolinde might give. She lit a 2nd candle and began. Theodolinde sat down at the small writing table in the corner of the dressing room and opened the document case herself. The correspondence with Dr. Alois Preysing, Pfarrer Ökonom of Altötting, occupied the left partition, 11 letters exchanged since February, the last 3 concerning the cadastral survey of the Burghausen estate and the disputed parcel boundaries along the eastern granary road. She had been building this project for 7 months. The Spiegelsaal had not caused it. The Spiegelsaal had simply provided the evening on which she could, without explanation or apology, go. She checked the correspondence, confirmed the sequence, and tied the partition closed with the green ribbon she used for active files. "Eleanor," she said, without turning from the desk, "when we arrive at Burghausen, I want the Arbeitszimmer opened before anything else is unpacked." "Yes, my lady," Eleanor said. She was folding a gray wool coat over the trunk lid with the efficiency of someone who had made this calculation before. "The carriage from the post station leaves at 11:30. "I know," Theodolinde said. "We will be on it." They were. The post-carriage south to Burghausen carried that night a merchant from Augsburg who had drunk himself to sleep before Schwabing, a young woman traveling to join a household in Rosenheim, and Theodolinde Auguste von Greifenberg Aschaffenburg, Herzogin zu Wiesenstein-Rottenbuch, who sat with her document case on her lap and watched the lights of Munich recede through the carriage window without the expression of a woman in flight. She had the expression, Eleanor thought, of a woman arriving somewhere she had intended to go for a considerable time. They reached Burghausen the following evening, as the last light was leaving the sky over the Salzach, and the Witwensitz received them with the particular silence of a house that has been managed at a distance and is accustomed to waiting. Dr. Preysing had left the Arbeitszimmer unlocked, as she had written him to do in March against the possibility of an unscheduled arrival. The granary records were on the table in the order she had requested. A fire had been laid, but not lit in the grate. Theodolinde set down her coat, picked up the first ledger, and walked the estate before she unpacked a single case. She went through the granary first, holding a lantern, reading the October tallies against the February projections Preysing had sent her in April. The discrepancy in the south grain shed was what she had suspected. Not fraud, but a system of measurement that had not been standardized across the two tenant families sharing the eastern boundary. She made a note in the margin of the ledger in her own hand and moved on to the stables, then to the boundary wall along the Altotting road, then back through the kitchen garden to the house. Eleanor was waiting at the back door with a cup of tea that had been hot when she poured it. The boundary markers need resetting on the eastern road, Theodolinde said, accepting the cup. I will write to Preysing in the morning. Of course, my lady, Eleanor said. Shall I have supper brought to the Arbeitszimmer or the dining room? The Arbeitszimmer, Theodolinde said. She sat down at the desk and opened the cadastral correspondence as though the night before had been an administrative matter requiring a change of location, because that was, among other things, precisely what it had been. In Munich, by midday of May 5th, the court had begun to murmur. Oberhof Marshal Gustav von Langenmantel had the content of Theodolinde's reply to Maximilian in his hands by evening. He had spent the morning writing to 3 colleagues, framing the incident in the Spiegelsaal as a matter of misunderstanding and feminine temperament, and had received back, by the afternoon post, 2 careful, non-committal replies, and one that quoted her words with the kind of precision that suggested the writer had already shared them elsewhere. Langenmantel was 52 years old, and had served 3 Herzogs. He understood, with the efficiency of a man whose entire career depended on the management of appearances, that the situation required containment. What he did not yet understand, what he would not understand for several months, was that the situation was not at its center about him. He would learn this slowly and at some cost. At the Residenz Schloss, Maximilian dismissed his attendants for the night at 10 o'clock and sat down at his writing desk in the Turmzimmer. He uncapped the inkwell. He wrote the date. He wrote her name. He read what he had written, and something in the arrangement of those letters on the page. The name he had spoken aloud in the Spiegelsaal in a tone he had heard somewhere before and could not quite place made him stop. He sat at the desk for an hour without adding a word. Then he took the paper and held it over the candle flame until it caught. And he set it in the grate and watched it burn to a shape that held its form for 2 seconds before collapsing. He did not go to bed until nearly 2 in the morning. The second letter, begun and abandoned at midnight, followed the first into the grate before the clock struck 2. By the time the ash had cooled, he was still sitting at the desk, not writing, not sleeping. listening to the specific quality of quiet in a house where the person who occupied the east-facing rooms had taken her document case and gone. 14 days passed in that fashion. 2 completed letters reduced to ash in the term Zimmer before dawn. The household staff moved around Maximilian with the practiced invisibility of servants who understand that their employer is in the grip of something he has not yet named, and that the most useful thing they can do is ensure the coffee is hot and the fires are laid, and no one asks him how he is managing. On the morning of the 15th day, Maximilian rose before his valet arrived, dressed himself in plain dark civilian clothes, no insignia, no court dress, nothing that announced a Herzog rather than a man, and walked to the public post station on the Zendlinger Strasse. He told no one where he was going. He sent no courier ahead. He bought a seat on the regular carriage south to Burghausen and took it. The carriage carried 6 passengers. Every one of them recognized him within the first quarter hour. Every one of them spent the next 6 hours in the careful performance of not having done so. A wool merchant from Landsberg studied his ledger with extraordinary concentration. A priest from Rosenheim looked out the window at a landscape that appeared to require his unbroken attention for the entire journey. Maximilian sat in the corner seat and did not speak. And the carriage rolled south through the afternoon, and the mountains came up ahead of them as the light began to change. And he watched them and thought about nothing he could have put into words, which was, he was beginning to understand, precisely the problem. He arrived at the Witwensitz gate at dusk. The steward, a compact man of 60 with the expression of someone who has received unexpected visitors before and has opinions about it, came to the gate at his knock. "Your name, sir?" the steward said, in the tone of a man who already knows the answer and is asking as a matter of form. He answered quietly, "Maximilian, only that." The steward looked at him for a moment, then nodded once and opened the gate. "If you will wait in the entrance hall, my lord. Her Grace is engaged with Dr. Preysing." "I will wait," Maximilian said. He stood in the entrance hall for 25 minutes. It was a plain room by court standards. Flagstone floor, a single bench, a landscape painting of the Salzach Valley that had been there since Theodolinda's grandmother's time. He did not sit on the bench. He stood and looked at the painting and listened to the sound of voices from behind the Arbeitszimmer door, Theodolinda's, even and precise, and Preysing's, measured and responsive. And the 25 minutes were the longest he had spent in a room since his mother's funeral. When the Arbeitszimmer door opened, Preysing came out first. He was a broad-shouldered man of 48, with ink-stained fingers and the careful eyes of someone who has spent decades reading documents that other people would rather not have read. He glanced at Maximilian without expression, nodded once in acknowledgement, and withdrew toward the back of the house without a word of introduction. Theodolinda stood in the doorway of the Arbeitszimmer. She was wearing a dark blue working dress, not court dress. Her hair was pinned plainly. There were ink marks on the outer edge of her right hand. She looked at him with the expression she had used in the Spiegelsaal. Not cold, not warm. The expression of a woman who has made a series of calculations and arrived at a conclusion she is prepared to act on. She did not offer him a chair. "You took the public post carriage," she said. "Yes," Maximilian said, "without staff." He met her eyes. "Yes." A pause. Theodolinda waited. "I am asking," Maximilian said, "to remain here, in whatever capacity you permit. I am not asking for—" He stopped. He began again. "I am not using the word you would expect me to use. I am asking only to be present, to demonstrate, if I can, that the man who spoke in the Spiegelsaals is not the only version of what I am." Theodolinda listened to this without moving. When he finished, She was quiet for a moment, and then she spoke in the tone she used for administrative arrangements. Clear, complete, without inflection that invited negotiation. "You took the land post carriage," she said. "That took something. I am noting it. But here you are a guest, Maximilian. The East Wing guest room, silence at meals, 3 weeks without a personal word between us. If those terms suit you, you may stay. If they do not, the carriage leaves at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and I will think no worse of you for taking it." Maximilian was still for a moment. Then he said simply, "I accept." Theodolinda opened the Arbeitszimmer door wider and stepped back to allow him through to the corridor beyond. As he passed, the brocade sleeve of her gown, the dark blue dress, had a narrow cuff of brocade at the wrist, a detail he had not noticed until this moment. Brushed the sleeve of his coat. It lasted 1 second. She drew her arm back precisely 1 centimeter and held it there. And then he was past her, and his footsteps were on the staircase. And Theodolinda turned back to the desk and the cadastral papers that were waiting exactly where she had left them. In the 3rd week of May, Oberhofmarschall Langenmantel arrived at the Residenzschloss in Munich and was shown into the blue reception room, where he found Graf Dietrich zu Wiesenstein-Rottenbuch managing the household in his brother's absence. Dietrich was 29 and had his brother's height and none of his brother's stillness. He received Langenmantel with the nervous courtesy of a younger son who knows he is being used as a proxy and is not entirely comfortable with it. Langenmantel proposed a public communiqué. "A matter of misunderstanding," he said. "A question of tone, not intent." The Herzogin had been fatigued. The Herzog had been imprecise. A brief statement, jointly attributed, would resolve the murmuring at court and allow the season to proceed without the shadow of an episcopal referral. Dietrich said he would convey the proposal to his brother. He sent a rider to Burghausen that afternoon. Maximilian received the letter 3 days later in the East Wing guest room, read it standing, and wrote back to Dietrich in 4 sentences. He was grateful for the Oberhofmarschall's attention. He declined the proposal, and he asked Dietrich to thank Langenmantel for his time and wish him well. He sealed the letter and gave it to the Burghausen steward for the morning post. And then he went downstairs and sat in the chair by the east window of the entrance hall. The chair he had begun occupying in the mornings, within view of the Arbeitszimmer door, but at a distance from it. And watched through the window as Theodolinda crossed the courtyard with praising, pointing toward the eastern boundary wall. And he said nothing, and wrote nothing, and burned nothing, because he had stopped beginning. Langenmantel received the reply, understood its meaning, and wrote that same evening to Bishop Conrad von Dorfler in Regensburg, framing the situation as a pastoral concern requiring episcopal attention before the 6-week deadline elapsed. At the Witwensitz, across those 3 weeks, Theodolinda conducted the estate as she had conducted it for 3 years at a distance, and was now conducting it in person. On day 22, she arbitrated a boundary dispute between 2 tenant families, the Heindels and the Webers, over a strip of land along the Eastern Granary Road. She heard both families in the courtyard, examined the survey marks herself, consulted the 1831 cadastral record that Preysing had retrieved from the parish archive, and ruled in favor of the Heindels based on the notation in the original survey. The ruling took 40 minutes. She did not consult Maximilian. He watched from the east window and did not offer to be consulted. 3 letters arrived from Freifrau Augusta von Greifenberg Aschaffenburg, Theodolinda's paternal grandmother, 71 years old and entirely accustomed to being heated, urging, with increasing specificity, the acceptance of a reparatory gesture. Theodolinda answered each letter with a single paragraph of polite, complete prose that acknowledged the advice and declined to act on it. The third reply, which Eleanor posted on the 21st day, was 2 sentences shorter than the first, which was itself the most precise communication Theodolinda had made on the subject of what she intended to do. Maximilian wrote no letters during those 3 weeks. There was nothing to burn because he had stopped beginning. He had begun, instead, to watch. The way Theodolinda corrected Preysing's ledger entries, not by crossing them out, but by writing the correct figure above and leaving the original legible. The way she listened to the Weber family's case with her hands clasped behind her back and her eyes on the survey mark in the ground rather than on the family's faces. The way she thanked Eleanor each evening for the tea that arrived at the Arbeitszimmer desk at 8:30, with a specificity of thanks that suggested she had noticed the temperature was exactly right and wanted this known. He had been in this house for 3 weeks, and he was beginning to understand that he had spent 8 months of marriage to a woman he had never once watched work. On the 31st day, the grain shed at the south end of the Heindel parcel in Altötting burned to the ground before dawn. The fire was intentional. A bundle of straw placed against the east wall with a burning rag, found by the Altötting Pfarrer at first light among the ash. The Heindel family had no doubt who had set it. The Weber family had no doubt who would be blamed for it. By mid-morning, the dispute that Theodolinda had ruled on 9 days earlier had escalated into something that required a formal proceeding, and Preysing arrived at the Witwensitz before noon, with the parish records under his arm and the expression of a man who has been managing boundary disputes for 20 years and knows what happens when they are not resolved completely. Theodolinda convened the arbitration at the Altötting Pfarrer for the following morning. She did not ask Maximilian to attend. He came to the Arbeitszimmer doorway that evening and knocked on the open door. "I have legal training," he said. "I am not proposing to sit as Herzog. I am proposing to transcribe. If you have someone else, I will stand aside." Theodolinda looked up from the document she was reading. She considered him for a moment with the particular attention she gave to cadastral records when something in them did not add up. "Be there at 8, she said, and returned to the document. He was there at 8. The arbitration room at the Altötting Pfarrer was a low-ceilinged chamber with whitewashed walls and a long oak table scarred by decades of documents and elbows. Preysing sat at the head of the table. Theodolinda sat to his left. Maximilian took the chair to Preysing's right, uncapped the inkwell that had been placed there, and positioned the paper. The Heindel family entered from the right door, Franziska Heindel, 58, with the bearing of a woman who has been managing land longer than most men in the room have been alive, followed by her son and his wife. The Weber family entered from the left, with their eldest son and the Altötting notary who had witnessed their original lease. For 2 hours they worked through the record. Preysing led the proceeding with the efficiency of long practice. Theodolinda asked 3 questions, each one targeted, each one drawing a specific fact from a specific person, rather than inviting general testimony. Maximilian transcribed. The same cadastral document passed across the table between them 3 times as each party annotated their claim, and it moved from hand to hand. Their fingers did not touch. The paper passed between them and carried, each time, the warmth of the previous hand. At the end of the second hour, Preysing had reached the question of the original parcel boundary. The strip of land that had been the source of the dispute before the fire made it a criminal matter. He was about to ask Franziska Heindel the standard question about prior ownership when Maximilian set down his quill. "I would like to ask," he said. He said it simply, not in the tone of a Herzog asserting authority, but in the tone of a man who has a question he needs answered. The parcel that burned, the south strip along the Altötting road. What was its ownership before the Wiesenstein estate acquired it? Franziska Händel looked at him. She had the steady eyes of a woman who has answered questions from powerful men before and has learned to answer them with the facts and nothing else, because the facts, in her experience, have always been sufficient. The meadow has belonged to the Wiesenstein estate since 1819, Franziska said. Before that it was Rottenbuch land, your mother's land, my Lord Herzog. Theresa von Rottenbuch Altötting. She did not sell it. She was required to surrender it when she married at 17. In Altötting, every person over 40 has known this for 28 years. The arbitration room was quiet. Maximilian did not move for a moment. Then very slowly, he set the quill down on the table. It rolled slightly and came to rest against the inkwell. He did not pick it up. Theodolinde, across the table, did not look away from him. She had spent 3 weeks watching this man watch her work, and she had been waiting without knowing she was waiting, for the moment when he stopped managing his own face. She was watching it now. He was not managing anything. The expression he wore was not grief and not shock. It was the expression of a man hearing a sentence he already knew and discovering, only now, that he knew it. Praising continued the record. His voice was level and professional. He asked Franziska the next question, and Franziska answered, and the proceeding moved forward. And Maximilian sat without speaking for 2 full minutes before he picked up the quill and resumed transcribing. His hand was steady. His face was not. The carriage back to Burghausen carried the 2 of them and Eleonore, who sat in the front-facing seat and found reasons to look out the window for the entire journey. Theodolinde sat opposite Maximilian and watched the road behind them through the rear window. Not at him, not at the landscape in particular, but at the middle distance where a person's eyes go when they are composing a sentence they have been composing for a long time. When Franziska spoke your mother's name, Theodolinde said, and you dropped the quill, I was watching you. That was the first honest minute of our marriage, Maximilian. 8 months. And the first minute was today. Maximilian looked at her. She was still looking out the window. He did not speak for the remaining 40 minutes of the journey. On the 36th day, at 2 in the morning, he wrote a 4th letter in the term Zimmer. He wrote it in a single draft, without pausing, without crossing out. When he finished, he read it once. He folded it, sealed it with plain wax, no crest, no initial, and set it on the writing table. Then he went to bed. He did not burn it. In the morning, he went to Altötting with Praising to confirm the arbitration records with the parish notary. And while he was gone, Theodolinde went to return a book she had borrowed from the guest room shelf 3 weeks earlier. The room was plain and tidy in the way of rooms occupied by people who have been trained not to impose. The bed made, the washstand clear, 2 books on the table, a coat on the hook behind the door, and on the writing table, a sealed letter with no address. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she crossed the room, picked up the letter, and put it in the pocket of her gray coat. She did not open it. She carried it out of the room and down the stairs and into the Arbeitszimmer. And she sat down at the desk with the letter in her pocket and worked for 3 hours. And the letter remained sealed. And she did not take it out again that day. On the 37th day, Langenmantel arrived at the Witwensitz gate in a court carriage with 2 outriders and the expression of a man who has decided that the situation requires his personal intervention and is prepared to be thanked for the inconvenience. Theodolinde received him at the gate. She did not open it. The estate belongs to me, she said, through the iron bars, in the tone she used for the cadastral correspondence, precise, complete, requiring no reply. The Herzog will be in Munich in 3 weeks. I wish you good day, Oberhofmarschall. Langenmantel opened his mouth. Theodolinde had already turned back toward the house. He stood at the closed gate for a moment, then got back into his carriage and returned to Munich, where, over the following 3 months, it became known among the Oberhofmarschall that the joke about provincial wives, the one Langenmantel had made 3 hours before the Spiegelsaal, the one Maximilian had laughed at, had been the source of the phrasing. The information moved through the court with the quiet efficiency of information that several people have been waiting to share. Langenmantel's standing did not collapse. It simply became, over those 3 months, less certain. For 4 days after the carriage ride, Maximilian did not come to meals. He did not leave the East Wing rooms except at dawn, when Eleonore sometimes saw him crossing the courtyard in the gray light with no coat, walking to the boundary wall and back as though counting the distance. Praising left a meal tray outside the door each evening and removed it in the morning without comment. On the second day of the silence, Praising delivered to the East Wing rooms, without ceremony and without explanation, an additional genealogical record he had located in the Altötting parish archive. A notation from 1819 in the hand of the parish notary, confirming Teresa von Rottenbuch Altötting's formal renunciation of her land upon marriage. The notation named the witnesses. The first witness was a man whose signature Maximilian had seen on one other document in his life. The Wiesenstein marriage contract, signed in the same hand, on the day Maximilian had married Theodolinde. The same notary, 38 years apart, the same legal mechanism, different women. Maximilian sat with this document for the remaining 2 days of his silence. And on the morning of the 39th day, he came downstairs, dressed, and told Praising that he wished to go to Rottenbuch. Theodolinde was already at the door with her gray coat. Neither of them had spoken to the other in 4 days. Neither of them asked how the other knew. Franziska Heindl met them at the cemetery gate. She was carrying a tin box, the kind used for documents in farmhouses, latched with a simple catch, the metal worn at the corners from handling. She said nothing by way of explanation. She walked to the grave of Teresa von Rottenbuch Altötting, set the box on the stone, unlatched it to show that it was full of papers, and latched it again. Then she walked to a distance of 40 paces, turned her back, and stood still. Maximilian looked at the box. He looked at the grave. He read the dates on the stone, 1801, 1828. 27 years. He had been 16 when she died. He had stood at this grave on a November morning with his father beside him and said nothing, because his father was beside him, and his father's presence had always been a reason to say nothing. He knelt on the cold ground. For 12 minutes, he did not speak. The cemetery was quiet around them. Late bird song, the wind moving through the larch trees at the eastern wall, the distant sound of a cart on the Altötting road. Theodolinde stood 4 meters away with her hands in the pockets of her gray coat and did not approach. When Maximilian spoke, he directed his words at the stone, not at Theodolinde. "Mutter," he said. His voice was level for the first 3 sentences. "Teresa, I stood at your bed 18 years ago, and I understood, without anyone saying it, what your marriage had been. I was 16, and I understood it the way a person understands something they have been watching for years, without admitting they are watching." He paused. When he continued, his voice broke once, on the name, Teresa, and then steadied. "I kept silent for 18 years because I believed I was protecting the family name. That is what I told myself, that I was protecting something. But in May, I stood in a room in Munich, and I spoke our father's sentence aloud, and I heard it for the first time, because I had never heard it from my own mouth before. I heard it and I knew it. The way you know a piece of music you have been humming without realizing. He spoke that way about you. I know he did. I was in the next room. I was always in the next room. And I said nothing for 18 years, and then I said it myself. And the only reason I heard it at all was because it came from my own mouth. He stopped. His head was bowed. I did not protect you, he said. I carried what he was, and I called it silence, and I called silence protection, and then I gave it to someone else. Theodolinda stood at her 4 meters and did not move. The wind moved through the larches. Franziska, at her 40 paces, remained still. After a long moment, Theodolinda took her right hand from the pocket of her gray coat. She had been carrying the sealed letter for 6 days. She walked the 4 meters to where he knelt, and she held the letter out. Not placed on the grave, not dropped, but held at the level where a kneeling man's hands would naturally be. He reached up. Their fingers touched over the paper. 2 seconds, neither withdrawing, neither gripping. And then the letter was in his hands, and her hands were empty. She did not say anything. She turned and walked alone toward the cemetery gate, her footsteps even on the stone path, her gray coat moving in the wind. Maximilian remained at the grave for 2 more hours. He did not open the letter until he was back in the East Wing rooms that night. When he did, he read it once, refolded it, and placed it in the inside pocket of his coat, where it remained for the following 6 months. In the 6th week, Bishop Conrad von Dorfler conducted the episcopal hearing at Regensburg. He was 64 years old and had the manner of a man who has presided over enough human difficulty to have lost the habit of surprise. The hearing was technical and unhurried. He reviewed the marriage contract, the residency arrangement, the cadastral correspondence, and the letter from Langenmantel, which he read with the careful expression of a man who has received letters from Langenmantel before and knows how to read between their lines. He asked 12 questions, received 12 answers, and granted the Civil Reconciliation Pact without requiring public appearances, ceremonial statements, or any discussion of what had been said in the Spiegelsaal. Neither Maximilian nor Theodolinda mentioned it. The hearing lasted 90 minutes. Dorfler offered them tea at the end, which they both declined, and they left Regensburg in separate carriages. 6 months after the Spiegelsaal, Maximilian returned to Burghausen, not as a guest, but as associate administrator of the cadastral project. He occupied the West Wing rooms and spent 4 months of the year in Munich, managing the Residenzschloss, attending the court obligations that his title required, and the remainder at Burghausen, working through the survey records with praising and, increasingly, with Theodolinda herself. There was no restoration ceremony. There was no public statement. There was, instead, the gradual accumulation of shared work. Documents passed across the Arbeitszimmer table. Questions asked and answered. The slow development of a professional shorthand between 2 people who had discovered that they were, whatever else they were, competent in overlapping ways. Graf Dietrich came to Burghausen once, in the autumn, ostensibly to review the Munich accounts. On his 2nd evening, after supper, he found Maximilian alone in the West Wing study and sat down across from him and was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone preparing to say something they have been carrying for a long time. I heard him once, Dietrich said. Our father. Speak that way. I was 12. I was in the corridor outside the library, and he said something to Mother, and I did not know what it meant at 12, but I knew it was wrong, and I went back to my room, and I never said anything about it. He looked at the table. Not to you? Not to anyone. Maximilian looked at his brother for a long moment. I know. Maximilian said quietly. They sat in silence for a while, and that stillness was different from the silences that had preceded it in that house. Not the silence of concealment, but the ease of two men who have said the thing they needed to say and are resting in the aftermath. 1 year after the Spiegelsaal, on an October morning with late snow on the gateposts of the Witwensitz, Preising arrived by carriage from Altötting before the sun had fully risen. The snow was the first of the season, thin and dry, sitting on the iron of the gate without melting, turning the gateposts white against the dark wood of the surrounding trees. Preising descended from the carriage with his document case under his arm and passed through the gate with a nod to the steward, heading toward the Arbeitszimmer and the final review of the cadastral survey that would go to the Bayerischer Landbote for publication that week. Theodolinde came out to receive him, pausing at the gate as his carriage moved through. She was wearing her gray wool coat. Her breath was visible in the cold air. Maximilian was standing beside the gatepost. She turned to him. Preising had already gone inside. The steward had withdrawn. The courtyard was empty except for the two of them and the sound of the carriage wheels on the stone. The Fahrer has just gone through the gate, Theodolinde said. He knows why he is here. I know why he is here. She looked at Maximilian directly, not the administrative look, not the careful calculation of the Arbeitszimmer, but something else. Something that had been present in the cemetery and in the carriage and in the passing of paper across a table, and in the 6 days she had carried a sealed letter in her pocket. The word forgiveness. I do not have it today, Maximilian. Perhaps I never will. What I have is this October morning, and a hand you may hold, if that is enough for you. He was quiet for a moment, not the silence of a man forming a response, but the stillness of a man who has learned, over the course of a long year, that some things do not require a response, only a presence. He placed his right hand on her left forearm. The gray wool of her autumn coat was cold from the air, and his hand rested on it for 7 seconds, not gripping, not demonstrating, simply resting, the weight of his palm on the wool. Then he leaned forward, and the cold of October arrived before his lips did. The air between them, sharp and clean, and carrying the smell of snow. And the kiss was brief and quiet, and entirely without ceremony, which was, in every way that mattered, the right kind of first kiss for two people who had spent a year learning what honesty cost. They walked toward the Witwensitz together. The snow on the gateposts continued its patient work of being snow. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in November, Theodolinde signed her name to an article in the Bayerischer Landbote, a cadastral record of the Berghausen estate boundaries, with annotations on the historical survey discrepancies and a proposed standard for boundary notation across the Altötting district. It was a technical document. It was also, as every person at the Bavarian court who read it understood, something that had not been done before. The first Herzogin in Bavaria to sign a public agrarian record in her own name, without a male co-signatory, without a title appended to justify the signature. Her name appeared at the bottom of the second page, written in the same clear hand she had used for 3 years of cadastral correspondence. Theodolinde Auguste von Greifenberg Aschaffenburg, zu Wiesenstein-Rottenbuch. No flourish, no apology. The ink had dried before anyone thought to object,